Welcome back, friends. I'm your host, Dorina Gilmore-Young.
And I'm Sean Young, and you're listening to Season 2, Episode 11 of Walk, Run, Soar, a podcast about the intersection of faith and running.
We are so excited to share today's episode with you. We help runners and walkers who lack purpose with their exercise routine or lack of routine and long to experience God in a more meaningful way while they walk or run. Today, we are interviewing Isabel Tom. She is a speaker, an educator, an author. She wrote the book, The Value of Wrinkles, a young perspective on how loving the old will change your life. And she loves running. She's married to Kevin, who is a PE teacher. They have 3 children and live in the DC area. So we are excited to share this conversation with you. We chatted with Isabel about how she was inspired to run her first marathon by an 84-year-old man she was friends with. And she also talked about how valuable it is to experience intergenerational family life. She shares a bit about her own family and growing up with her grandparents. And then we also talked about the recent attacks on Asian American elders and how we are processing that. So friends, this is a meaningful conversation that we would love for you to stick around for.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We are here to run with you, to pace you, and to inspire you with weekly devotionals, scripture, interviews, and quick coaching tips in about the time it will take you to go out for a short run or walk. So pop in your earbuds and listen in.
Each week, I start by sharing a short word of encouragement from Scripture to help give you a cool drink of living water before we go into our interview time. And many of these are adapted from my new devotional book, Walk, Run, Soar, which is available in all the places where books are sold. It's available in paperback, hardback, ebook, as well as audiobooks. So we would love to be able to share this book with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about the theme, Your Race Isn't Over Yet. And I'd like to start by reading a passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. This is in the Message version of the Bible. It says, "So we're not giving up. How could we? Even though on the outside, it often looks like things are falling apart on us, on the inside, where God is making new life, not a day goes by without his unfolding grace." So I've been running with my dad since I was a little girl. And the first race we ran together was called the Ridge Run. It was a 10K on the south side of Chicago near the neighborhood where I grew up. And I remember that it was a big deal to be able to run this race with my daddy. There were more than 3,000 runners gathered for this race. It was typically run on Memorial Day, so it was followed by the Memorial Day parade. So everyone in the neighborhood would line the course and come out and cheer, and they would play motivating music for the runners. And the course ran along Longwood Drive that was in our neighborhood. And it included one of the steepest hills in Chicago. I know you probably don't think of Chicago as being a very hilly place, but it was one of the things that was a feature of this race. So my dad helped me to train for this race. I think I was in 3rd grade, and he would take me out for jogs in the neighborhood. And while we ran, he would talk to me about breathing and pacing. And I remember he talked to me about building up our strength and stamina for race day. He knew that 8 city blocks in Chicago equaled a mile. And so we would often run counting our city blocks, and Dad would map out our mileage before we ran. Now, some days those miles felt long to my 9-year-old legs. And even if I was tired, my dad would not let me stop. He would urge me to just keep moving forward. And I think about the Apostle Paul and how he wrote those encouraging words to the church in Corinth that I read at the beginning. This idea that we are not giving up, that even though on the outside, maybe our bodies, it looks like we're falling apart, but on the inside, God is renewing our spirits every day. And Paul reveals a key to the Christian life, that we can be renewed daily in our spirits because of God's unfolding grace. So friends, this affects our bodies too, enabling us to keep going even when we feel tired, even when we feel worn out and old. This was an important message for the Christians who were living in Corinth because they were facing false teachers and discouragement. And Paul continues to remind them that their current troubles were achieving for them an eternal glory. This is a powerful reminder for us today, too. You and I will face trials on this earth, but we will experience God's glory and be rewarded in heaven. And so as I look back, I treasure those times that I had running with my dad. Now my dad is in his late 70s and he is still running 5Ks and 10Ks and the occasional half marathon. And he has faithfully run and raised thousands of dollars for our Remember Haiti fundraiser team for the last decade. He has been faithful. My dad's legs are a little slower and his breathing is definitely heavier. He struggles with sciatica, but he will not stop. In fact, his doctors have told him that he needs to slow down, but well, a guy in his 70s who doesn't listen. In fact, he's made it to the podium several times to get awards in the 70 plus age group, which he's especially proud of. And we love it too. So friends, I just want to encourage you, no matter what stage of life you're in, that you remember we're not promised tomorrow. So if we're still living today, our race isn't over yet. And my dad serves as this constant inspiration to me to persevere, to persist, that is something that is an admirable quality of the Christian life and in running. And we all have to keep running this race set before us for God's glory. Welcome back to Walk, Run, Soar. We're so grateful that you are here with us today, and I am very excited to introduce you to today's guest. Her name is Isabel Tom, and she is the author of a book called The Value of Wrinkles, a young perspective on how loving the old will change your life. She's been featured on numerous radio shows and podcasts, including Building Relationships with Dr. Gary Chapman and AARP's Take On Today. She's also a wife, a mom, a daughter, and forever grandchild who is passionate about serving the older adult population. Isabel lives in the DC area. She and I met through the Someday is Here online event and podcast that my friend Vivian Mabuni hosts. She's got some great running stories, and she's going to invite us to think about this idea of having relationships and friendships with older adults. So welcome, Isabel. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are spending your days, what your household looks like, all that good stuff?
Hi, Dorina. Hi, Sean. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. So my days are filled with kids. Because of COVID, I'm actually a new homeschool mom. You can see some of my things in the background. So
girl.
My days are filled teaching. My kids are 4, 6, and 8. So it's pretty chaotic and crazy. And we just switched over in our area. Teachers just went back to school and kids had the opportunity to go back to school. So my husband is a teacher. He's a PE teacher. Up until last week, he was in the basement and he's given off directions on different exercises and how to kick and do all these things. And then we're up here doing our school. So it's pretty busy. It's been pretty crazy, but also a lot of fun too.
So tell us, how did you get started with running?
So I could talk on and on about this, which is why I love your podcast. I think as a kid, I was one of those kids who maybe I was more of a tomboy. And so, people would want to race after school and I would race. I never was the fastest, but maybe one of the fastest girls. And I would say my love for running started because I played field hockey. I played soccer growing up, but then I played field hockey, and also in college I played field hockey, and I was redshirted my first year. And because I was redshirted, what that meant is that I didn't play in the games, but I sat on the bench, and I also didn't travel away to games. So when my team was away, then I befriended the cross country team and I started running with them. And one of my friends that was on the cross country team on the off season, when I wasn't playing field hockey, she would take me on runs, and I never liked running. but she would get lost wherever we were running in the trails. And so our runs ended up being like an hour long. And I never, ever thought I was able to run longer than that. So that was the first time I experienced runner's high. And that kind of got me started, I would say. After college, it's hard to play team sports sometimes if you can't get a group of people. Yeah. So that's when I started deciding to train for some races.
So I love that you got to hang out with the cross country team. And I understand that just being active and being outdoors is something that you really value as a family, something that refreshes you. So can you share with us a little bit more about what that looks like in this season of life now that you're a mom and you have kids and extended family around you?
Sure. So when I was in my 20s and I didn't have kids, I was determined, I started racing and I was like, I'm going to run half marathons. I'm going to run marathons and I'm going to qualify for Boston. And I'm going to run marathons until however old I am. But then I had kids and it was really hard to run. So for the first 2 kids, I was able to still run and train for half marathon. But now with, what's going on and how I'm homeschooling and everything, and running and having an active lifestyle is just so important. So anytime somebody gets grumpy, including myself, we are going to go outside and we're going to get some physical activity. My kids, they actually, I have it right here. They get a marble for having a good attitude, but they also get a marble if mommy goes out and runs. So
I love it.
Like nagging abilities to remind me and always keep me accountable, like go out for a run, because they want a marble, because they know that when I go for a run, I am calmer, I am kinder. And if we're going to the playground or wherever we are, it's not like I'm necessarily training for a race, but I'm the mom who's like doing lunges or just trying to get physical activity anywhere. And even when it's cold, we gear up, we get our wool socks and our hats and everything. And we just go outside because we know it's good for us. It refreshes all of us, every single day.
So it costs you a marble to go out on a run. Is that what I'm hearing?
It doesn't cost me a marble. I have tons of marbles. They get a marble. And I realized that was an effective way to make sure that I would exercise.
I love that.
Isabel, I know you recently published a book called The Value of Wrinkles. Can you tell us about the theme of the book and why you wrote it?
So I grew up living in a multi-generational household. That was my parents, my 2 sisters, and then my grandparents. And so I was born and my grandparents were 68 and 71. And when they passed, they were 98 and 102. So I spent my first 35 years of my life either living or caring for my grandparents. And then professionally, my first job out of college was working at a local retirement community. And I like to say, like, after the first day, I was hooked. And so God really used that experience and my professional career to give me a different perspective. And I like to say that He allowed me to know what it was like to age without having to get white hairs, without having to have a walker. And because I live next to my grandparents, like literally in the room next door, it gave me a different perspective. So I realized that perspective is unique and that a lot of other people my age, older than me, younger than me, maybe they don't have a lot of interaction with older people and they have a lot of misconceptions. And as a Christian, I believe that, God values people as they get older, but in this society, that is not the way that they are treated. So I just wanted to be able to share my experience, give another perspective, and kind of empower family members to want to give their older loved ones a proper send-off, to honor, respect them, love them.
Mm. Well, I love this perspective that you unfold in your book. And I actually recently wrote an article about my grandfather who lived with my late husband and I when we first got married. So we were newlyweds in our 20s and my grandpa was in his 90s, 80s. And it was, very different from the experience of other, young couples in our kind of age range and demographic. Absolutely. But it was such a sweet season in our lives that, especially for me, that I could provide a home and cook for my grandpa after he had worked for so many years providing for our extended family. And I learned lots of patience
Yeah.
during that season and caring for him. And it was just one of the experiences in my life that I look back on. And I'm so thankful that God allowed me to have that time before he did, go to heaven. So I wanted to ask you about one of the chapters in your book because it's running related. And you share this story about one of your senior friends who inspired you to run your first few marathons. So can you unpack that story for our listeners a little bit?
Sure. So one of my first jobs at the retirement community that I worked at was working in senior fitness. So I was a wellness coordinator and helped to run the fitness center. And so, people would come in and I would just meet hundreds. This community is about 3,000 older adults. And so they would come into the fitness center and I got to meet people of all kinds. So I was in my early to mid 20s when I was working in that job. And one of the residents I met, he found out that I had run a half marathon, and as a runner, he just started talking to me a lot. And so we just had a lot in common. And I found out he had started running after 50. And then he ran 5 marathons in his 60s and early 70s. And I was like, what?
Wow.
Because I had never run a marathon before. And I was one of those people who was like, that's crazy. Whoever runs marathons, like, they're nuts, right? So once I heard that he had run it and he was like, you can do it, I felt like I had no excuse because I was like 23, 24. Like I had no reason to say no. So I ended up signing up for my first marathon, the Marine Corps marathon. And because he actually was still running during that time, not training for races, but he was regularly running, he would come into the fitness center. Like I worked there 5 days a week. And he'd ask me, so, how many miles did you run? And if I was going to be lax in my training, like this was really not the time because I had somebody who was like 84 asking me. So it was a little embarrassing if I said I didn't train. So I was like on it. I followed the Hal Higdon, training plan, and I trained, and I actually felt great after I ran it. But it was really funny. He emailed me like the next day when I came in, and he had already checked my time on the internet, and that's pretty good, but I think you can run faster. So I actually signed up for it again the year after, but it was really his inspiration that, and accountability that helped me sign up for that race and run my first and second marathon.
Yeah, the Marine Corps Marathon, I ran that, maybe like a dozen years ago. I love that course, although it does have a very, very steep hill to the finish line. That last quarter mile, oh my word, that's a steep hill.
Yeah, I never seen grown men cry until I was running that last mile, and I was like, wow. So
incredible. Well, I love how your friend inspired you. And it does also speak to the power of accountability. Just having one person who checks in on you for your workouts, that can make all the difference for our training.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
Well, I also wanted to ask you a little bit more about your family. I know that you shared a bit in the beginning as well, but you talk about growing up in this multi-generational Asian American home. And I'm wondering if you can describe that a little bit more for us and how it shaped your outlook on life.
So I think growing up, I think there are a lot of my friends who are Asian American. They may have grown up with their grandparents. For me, I think what was different was that my grandparents lived a long time, like a long time.
Yeah.
And so it was into high school and college and after college. So I lived in the same house with them until I was 26. And my story is similar to yours in that my sister and my brother-in-law, they ended up inviting my grandparents to live with them when they were in their late 20s. And so the way that our household looked, especially in their 90s, was little children crawling on the floor, plus seniors, so you didn't have like baby gates or anything like that. It was just a totally different lifestyle. I think growing up in having my grandparents live with me, because I'm Asian American, but I think most of my life I've considered myself more American because I just grew up in the US. And so that's like my connection to my heritage very much. I speak Cantonese, and that's the reason I'm able to speak Cantonese is really only because my parents tried to have like Tuesdays where they'd try to speak Chinese to us, and we would just answer in English because we knew that they could understand us. So with time, I have come to appreciate that experience so much more. And even now I'm learning with my kids as I'm homeschooling them about our history as Chinese living in the US. So it's definitely, shaped who I am today, and I'm gaining a greater appreciation for it.
Oh, I appreciate you just sharing a bit about that. And, for our listeners, Sean and my background, both, we have some Asian American. His family is Chinese American. And then my family is Filipino, Chinese, and Polynesian. I'm also on journey, like you were talking about, learning about the history, trying to figure out how to share and impart both that knowledge and pride to our own 3 daughters, and, blending our families and getting to explore more Chinese American culture with Sean's family. And he gets to be adopted into our big fat Filipino. I can't help but mention, we woke up this morning, and I know this podcast is going to be running a week later, but we woke up this morning to the sobering news that 8 people were shot in Atlanta last night, and most of them were older Asian American women. Right now, the news is kind of unfolding, but this was a racially motivated event. So I'm just wondering, how are you doing, especially in this last year, in light of many attacks that have been on Asian Americans during the pandemic, and specifically on our elders?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the older adult population, I've always been an advocate for them since I started working in the field and serving them professionally. And I really feel like when it comes to older adults, and this is something that I felt before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic has just kind of brought more attention to it, is that older adults, they're struggling with a lot of things, and a lot of times we just don't notice. But isolation, it is their normal a lot of times in our society, whether they are physically disabled or not. A lot of times we just kind of push them to the side and we don't listen to their stories. We consider it complaining. And so as people age, I feel like it's my duty, it's my responsibility as a younger person to advocate for them, do what I can using the energy that I have to speak up for them. I worked in hospice care, so that's serving people who are near the end of their lives. And in hospice, the people we're serving, they cannot speak a lot of times, literally cannot speak. And so they need their loved ones to speak up for them. When it comes to Asian American older adults, my grandparents, my grandpa could speak English, my grandma could not. And especially for my grandma, she didn't want to cause a fuss about things. And so I think with all of these stories that we're hearing, the good part of this is that people are hearing that this is an issue, but I think there's so many stories that are not told. And so I think it's important for us to realize that just because we don't hear those stories, it doesn't mean that it's not an issue. So it is something that I'm processing too. And as somebody who is an advocate for older adults and as an Asian American, that's something that is heavy on my heart. And I'm still trying to see how I can serve older adults in the Asian American community more with my platform. So if you have any ideas, let me know.
Well, I appreciate that reflection. And I know that, the news is just rolling out as we speak. So it's hard sometimes to even articulate all those emotions and the grief that we are going through. But I think your book is a phenomenal way that you are using your platform to help educate people and to really cast those relationships that are intergenerational in a good light, and even to inspire people to want to seek out, what are the stories of my grandparents, or what are the stories of the elders and senior population around me. So I love that you wrote a whole book about it. I was so excited when I received your book because I realized, wow, there's not much that I have seen that has been written on this topic.
I understand your grandpa had a practice of walking that lasted for most of his life. Can you share about that and how he inspired you?
Sure. Actually, it has to do with running because I was living with him when I was training for the Marine Corps Marathon. So my grandpa, up until he was 97, for 6 days a week, except for Sunday, he would strap on his shoes, put on his jacket, take out his cane, and he would walk for an hour and 15 minutes every day, like very disciplined.
Wow.
And I say that's how he lived so long. He was really healthy. I mean, he was walking till 97. And so that was an example to me of discipline that I still remember now. When I step outside,
Mm.
I realized that I have part of that in me. I watched him from the windowsill walking across our neighborhood. When I was training for the Marine Corps Marathon, he didn't really understand why I was doing what I was doing, but he would come back from his walk and I'd come back from my run and he'd be like, I would say, I just ran 15 miles today. And he would just start cracking up laughing. And so that would happen, every time I went out for a run. But he was outside regularly exercising. And I can see just how healthy it was, how healthy it is for us to be physically active and how it makes a difference as you get older too.
That's such a great example. And it's funny because I mentioned before about my grandpa living with me. And that was one of our favorite things that we did together is that we would walk through the neighborhood.
Mm.
So I have kind of a visual of your grandpa putting his shoes on and getting out there and walking and you doing your 15 miles and him laughing. It seems like something that my grandpa would do as well.
We would run the turkey chase every year. And I tried to get him to sign up when he was 96 or 97, but he had a routine. So he was like, I don't wake up that early. I do my walks after lunch, but I was so trying to get him to do it. I was like, you'd be in the news, but he didn't go for it.
He probably would have won his age group.
Yeah, don't mess with the routine of a 97-year-old.
Yeah, it didn't work.
That's extraordinary. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. And because you're one of our listeners, you know that one of our passions on this podcast and partly why we wrote our book is that we love to talk about this intersection between running and faith. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how your faith journey has been informed by your running.
So I would say it's running and just physical activity and sports in general. I'm going to go back to when I played field hockey in college because I'm a pastor's kid. And so I think I grew up with this misconception that the only way that I can worship God is by singing. And I am not like an American Idol singer. I mean, I can sing, but it's not my only thing. It's not my thing. And so when I was in college and played field hockey, I went to a Christian college. And that was the first time it struck me that I could worship God through my practice and playing field hockey. I could worship him on the field. And so that completely changed the way that I viewed God, and it changed my relationship with him. And in running, I guess there are a couple of things. It empowered me to be able to see that I'm able to do more than I believe I can. Mm-hmm. And that God helps me to do that. In running, that's a place where I hear from God, that I reflect on what God's doing in my life. I'm not the type of person who it's been easy for me to sit down and do my Bible study right out in front of me. I mean, I do read my Bible, but the times when I feel like it really sinks into my heart is when I'm running. And so that time of reflection, that time to kind of just get out from my own view and to remember not to lean on my own understanding. When I go outside and run, I see God's creation below me, above me, around me. And that's just so comforting to me. It has everything to do with my faith. And it's something that even when I'm not able to run anymore, I want to be able to walk. And if I'm not walking, then I want somebody to be pushing my wheelchair outside so that I can just experience God. I think that's how I experience God the most.
Is there any passage in the Bible or scripture verses which encourages you as you work out or run?
So I would say when I was in college and I had to do like sprints, or I did run indoor track for one season because I wanted to run a 6-minute mile, but that's not like fun running. So during that time, I would always run to the cadence of like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It's not always the same verse. it's really whatever verse that God has impressed upon my heart, whether it's through my Bible study or now I'm doing homeschooling and we memorize a verse each week with my kids. And I feel like the verse is really for me. When I run, that's how I would say that's how I meditate on scripture is when I run, I pray, but then that's how I memorize the word of God. So the one from Christmas time that I still have written down and I try to remember when I run is, that God is a wonderful counselor. He's a mighty God. He's everlasting Father and Prince of Peace. So just to remember the attributes of God. And like I said, if I just tried to sit here and memorize it, I don't think it would really sink in. But it's when I'm running that somehow it's etched into my memory more.
I think you're right. I think there's just something about moving our bodies as we're meditating on those words that just allow it to stick even better. I think about my very first marathon that I did years ago, and my late husband, Eric Lee, and I memorized Acts 20:24. And it's the verse that always comes to me when I'm running now, especially when I'm getting to those harder miles at the end of a race. It's just so interesting how similar to you, I'll just start reciting it in my head like a mantra. And I think, that movement coupled with the memorization for me as well makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think it's the mental toughness. By memorizing it helps you get through that mentally tough part of the race or training.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. Well, one of the things that's humbling about running races is when there are people from different generations who are passing us as we're running. And I'm just wondering, how do you fight comparison while you are running?
So my husband would hear me talk about this a lot before. I call it speed envy, especially when I was training for races. I'm like, oh, you look up other people's times and you're like, I can't believe she ran that, And so I've really had to remind myself that my speed does not determine my value and that I'm in a different place. One thing that I've had to grapple with is the fact that I can't always run now. I can't train for races. I'm just not in a spot where it's easy for me to do that now. And I have to remind myself that even when I walk, that's okay too, but that it doesn't determine my value. Now, if I get back to training, I will be looking at my time and that I enjoy the challenge of trying to beat my time. But I think it's something that all athletes probably struggle with from time to time.
I am wondering if you have a favorite race that you have run.
So my very first half marathon was the Parks Half Marathon. It's in Rockville, Maryland. And that's my favorite course. And I haven't run it maybe in 2-3 years, but that is my favorite race.
So it's the one you keep going back to?
Yeah.
Love it.
Nice.
We have some local races that it's just fun to keep going back and use it as a marker in your running and in your life. And so, have you run that one? Parks?
No, I haven't. I'm familiar with it. I have a lot of friends who have, but I haven't actually made it down there. I have run.
I did the Baltimore half marathon.
Yes.
So,
I've done
that one had a big hill, so I didn't really like that one.
Baltimore definitely has some hills.
I didn't know it, and I didn't know to look at the charts beforehand, so I didn't really enjoy that.
Yeah, Baltimore is a challenging event. I've done the half marathon and marathon there, and I'm pretty wiped out.
That was only my second half marathon, so I wasn't experienced enough to look into all the details about it. I just thought the shirt was cool, so not how to run.
Some people are motivated by the medals. Some people are motivated by the shirts.
Absolutely. Well, Isabel, we've really enjoyed our time with you on our podcast today. But before we close, how can we support you best in what you're doing?
So I would say first, you can check out my book, The Value of Wrinkles, a young perspective on how loving the old will change your life, especially if you're caring for an older person. If you are a grandchild, especially, I add in a lot of the heart and our perspective of how we should go about caring for our older adults. There's also experiences from my professional life. So I'd encourage you to read that. You can find me at isabeltom.com. You can find me at Instagram at isabelctom. And, You guys have inspired me. I kind of want to start a podcast, so we'll see. Maybe you can find me there one day.
Well, thanks again for being on our podcast. And we will definitely share in the show notes about your book and how people can get a hold of you.
Thank you, Dorena. Thank you, Sean.
This week's coaching tip is about using your arms while running. Now, when most people think of running, they think about their legs. But when I'm coaching athletes, I first want them to focus on their arms, because your arms really determine what your legs do. They keep your legs moving. The faster you move your arms, guess what? The faster your legs will move. This is critical in the later stages of a race when fatigue sets in. If you keep pumping your arms, your legs will follow. So keep your arms swinging and get across your next finish line. We also want to invite you to share your questions about running and walking. If you go to the Anchor app or web link for our podcast, there's a spot where you can click message and leave me your questions. Be sure to include your name and city when you ask your questions, and I'll try to incorporate these in future podcasts.
Before we close today, I wanted to share a few more details with you about our new book, Walk, Run, Soar. It's a 52-week devotional and training journal that's designed for runners and walkers. We wrote this book for you, and I know that some of you are longing to experience God's presence in a deeper way as you pound the pavement or traverse the trails. We talked about this a little bit with Isabel in our interview today, that getting out there, running and walking, being on the trails, being out in God's creation is one of the ways that we can feel his presence in a much more powerful and meaningful way. And so that's what I write about a lot in this book. The devotionals are stories from my own life and what I've experienced through running. And then Sean's coaching tips are at the end of each of the devotionals. So if you week by week or whenever you read the devotionals, start incorporating some of those tips, like the ones we mentioned here in the podcast, it's a great way to improve as a walker or runner. Friends, hop over to Amazon or you can check out our website. We would love it if you would order a copy of our book, or if you already have one, if you would consider sending it to a friend or family member who enjoys walking and running as well.
Have you ever determined what type of biblical runner you are? Well, we have the Biblical Runners Quiz over at www.dorenagilmore.com. Right on that homepage, if you scroll down to the Run section, you'll see a button for the Biblical Runners Quiz. It is a 15-question quiz where it will determine whether you're a runner like Paul or Peter or possibly Esther or even David. There are 10 different biblical characters who you may match up with.
And last but not least, I want to just encourage you also to sign up for my Glorygram while you're there at the website. It's a special curated letter for the insider crowd where I share an inspiring story every week, a list of recommendations, recipes, podcasts, and as always, a coaching tip from Sean. So you can subscribe there at the website. I love writing the Glorygram. It's actually my favorite thing that I write all week because I get to be connected with you more personally and share some of the things that God's been teaching me and our family. Friends, thank you for joining us today for episode 11 of season 2. And next week is the grand finale, our final episode of the season. So don't miss it. We have a special guest, Kadivis Robinson, who is an Olympian and has an amazing story. See you soon.